What if I told you that behind the stone walls of medieval castles, hidden from the watchful eyes of priests and kings, a revolution was being written? While we imagine 11th century ladies sitting demurely in towers, praying and embroidering, some of them were actually composing poetry so steamy, so bold, so unapologetically sexual that it would make modern romance novels blush. We're talking about women who dare to write about their deepest, most intimate desires in an age when the church could literally burn you alive for such thoughts. But here's the twist that will keep you awake tonight. These weren't just a few random rebels. These were some of the most powerful, educated, and influential women of their time. And their secret writings, a testament to their courage, survived 1,000 years of systematic attempts to erase them from history. Get comfortable, because what you're about to discover will flip your entire understanding of the Middle Ages upside down. Before we pull back the veil on these scandalous secrets together, I'd love for you to join our secret society of history lovers. Think of hitting that subscribe button as your initiation into our exclusive club, where we uncover the stories that have been deliberately hidden from us. If this tale grabs you by the collar like it grabbed me, show some love by hitting that like button. It's the modern-day equivalent of passing a secret note, letting me know you're ready for more. I'm genuinely curious about where our club members are tonight. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're tuning in from. There's something magical about knowing we're all gathered from different corners of the globe, united by a love for the untold stories of the past. All right, dim those lights. Let's step into the shadows and meet the women who history tried and failed to forget, the myth of the silent woman. Here's a picture we've all been sold about the 11th century. Women were property, silent, obedient, and certainly not writing anything steamier than a grocery list. But that's a carefully crafted illusion, a historical fabrication designed by those in power to maintain control. The reality is so much more electrifying. The 11th century, contrary to popular belief, was one of the most sexually liberated periods for women in all of medieval history. I know what you're thinking, but what about the Dark Ages? What about the iron fist of the church? This is where the story gets truly fascinating. The 11th century wasn't nearly as dark as we've been led to believe. It was a period of incredible cultural renaissance, particularly in regions like southern France, northern Italy, and parts of what we now call Germany. The Crusades had not yet transformed Europe into a paranoid, while undeniably powerful, had not yet become the monolithic, thought-policing institution it would later be. And most crucially, noble women in this era wielded significantly more power and autonomy than they would in the centuries that followed. Let me paint you a more accurate picture of what was really happening. In the sophisticated courts that predated Eleanor of Aquitaine, in the intellectual salons hosted by countesses, and in the monasteries where learned nuns had access to libraries that would make modern scholars weep with envy, women were not just reading and writing. They were exploring profound themes of love, desire, and yes, explicit sexuality, with a boldness that would shock even our supposedly progressive modern world. And this is where our story gets really juicy. They had to be incredibly clever about it. These women were not reckless. They understood the immense risks. They knew that one wrong word, one too obvious metaphor, could mean exile, excommunication, or a fate far worse. They developed what I like to call the secret language of desire. They created an entire coded vocabulary, a system of intricate metaphors and symbols that allowed them to write the most passionate, sensual poetry while maintaining just enough plausible deniability to keep their heads attached to their shoulders. Take, for instance, the mysterious Comtessa de Gia, the Countess of Dye. Her true name is lost to history, a testament to how carefully these women had to guard their identities. But her poetry survived, and it is utterly breathtaking in its audacity. In one of her most famous works, she writes of longing to hold her lover, naked in my arms, and describes her desire with such raw, explicit emotion that medieval scribes, men sworn to celibacy, literally blushed while copying her words. This wasn't some anonymous peasant girl scribbling in secret. This was a noble woman, a woman of high standing and influence, putting her reputation and possibly her life on the line for the sake of authentic, passionate expression. And she was far from alone. From the sun-drenched courts of Provence to the scholarly monasteries of Germany, women were picking up their quills and writing with a passion and honesty about sexuality that would not be seen again in Western culture for centuries. They wrote about everything: the ecstasy of physical love, the agony of unfulfilled desire, the complexities of emotional intimacy, and even critiques of men's sexual performance that would make a modern-day dating app review seem tame by comparison. But here's what's truly mind-blowing. These were not just love poems. These women were using erotic poetry as a vehicle for something far more subversive. They were writing about consent, a concept we mistakenly believe is a modern invention, but was actually being explored and debated by medieval women 1,000 years ago. They were critiquing the patriarchal power structures that sought to confine them. They were claiming ownership of their own sexuality in a world that relentlessly told them their bodies belonged to their fathers, then their husbands, and finally their sons. The surviving evidence is scattered across ancient manuscripts, hidden in the archives of monastery libraries, and the private collections of noble families across Europe. Scholars estimate that we have lost as much as 90% of the literature written. Much of it was deliberately destroyed by later, more conservative generations who were horrified by the boldness of their female ancestors. What survived is absolutely revolutionary. While we are taught that the sexual revolution began in the 1960s, these 11th century women were already there, already fighting for the right to express their desires, already refusing to be ashamed of their sexuality. They were writing what amounted to instruction manuals for lovers, complaints about bad sex, celebrations of good sex, and even philosophical treatises on the very nature of human desire. All of it was cleverly disguised as courtly poetry that could be read aloud in mixed company, without causing a public scandal. And the most incredible part? Some of these women were nuns. Yes, you heard that right. In convents across Europe, women who had supposedly renounced all worldly pleasures were writing some of the most passionate and erotic poetry of the entire medieval period. They weren't necessarily breaking their vows. Many of them were exploring spiritual ecstasy using erotic metaphors, ingeniously blurring the lines between divine love and human love, suggesting they might not be so different after all. But as we will discover, this golden age of female sexual expression was tragically short-lived. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the cultural tide was turning. The church was consolidating its power, becoming more rigid, more paranoid about any challenge to its authority. The Crusades were militarizing society, making it more hierarchical, more brutal. And slowly but surely, the intellectual and social space that had allowed women to write so boldly about their desires began to close. The question that haunted me as I researched this story was simple. If women in the 11th century could write with such freedom and passion about sexuality, what happened to silence them? How do we go from this incredible flowering of female erotic literature to the tired, oppressive stereotype of the silent medieval woman that most of us carry in our heads? That is a story of political intrigue, religious persecution, and a cast of most fascinating women you've never heard of. Because these weren't just poets. They were revolutionaries. And their words were their weapons in a war most people didn't even realize was being fought. A war for the right to desire, to express, and to be fully human in a world that wanted to reduce them to mere property. So get ready, because we are about to meet some of the most remarkable, rebellious, and downright scandalous women in all of history. Women who risked everything for the right to write about love, lust, and the complicated, beautiful territory in between. Women whose courage echoes across 1,000 years, reminding us that the fight for authentic self-expression is as old as humanity itself. The rebel poetesses. Let's step into the shadows of history and meet the women who turned their pens into weapons of rebellion. But first, a word of warning. Some of these stories are so outrageous, so deliciously scandalous, that you might find yourself questioning everything you thought you knew about medieval morality. Our first rebel isn't who you'd expect. Her name was Beatrice de Gier, and she lived in what is now southern France around the year 1140. Most history books, if they mention her at all, will tell you she was a minor noblewoman who wrote courtly poetry. What they won't tell you is that she was essentially the medieval equivalent of a rock star who just happened to write the most explicit and empowering love songs of her era. Beatrice wasn't content to sit quietly in her castle, embroidering and waiting for her husband to return from yet another hunting trip. She decided to take matters into her own hands. She began writing poetry that was so sexually charged, so unapologetically passionate, that even today, nearly 900 years later, her words have the power to make you blush. In one of her most famous pieces, she writes, and I'm translating from the original Occitan here, "I want to hold my knight naked in my arms, for I am more in rapture than blanched flower with Floris." That might sound relatively tame to our modern ears, but in 1140, this was the literary equivalent of dropping a nuclear bomb in the middle of Sunday, Massachusetts. She is literally describing wanting to hold a man, not her husband, completely naked in her arms. The scandal was immense. But here's where it gets even more delicious. Beatrice wasn't just writing about desire in the abstract. she was writing instruction manuals. In another poem, she details exactly how she wants to be touched. This is the part that made medieval scribes drop their quills in shock. She explicitly states that women have a right to seek physical pleasure for its own sake, not just for procreation. This wasn't just revolutionary thinking. This was heretical. The church taught that women were essentially walking temptations, responsible for the fall of man, and that any sexual pleasure they experienced was a dangerous reminder of Eve's original sin. But Beatrice looked at those teachings and essentially said, "Hold my wine and watch this." And she wasn't alone. Due to Marie de France, a woman so mysterious that scholars still debate whether she was an abbess, a countess, or possibly even related to royalty. What we do know is that she wrote some of the most psychologically complex and sexually frank literature of the entire medieval period. Marie had this incredible gift for taking traditional stories and turning them completely on their heads. She'd take a classic tale about knights and damsels, and suddenly, boom, the damsel is seducing the knight, making all the decisions, and often leaving him completely bewildered by her sexual confidence. In her story, L'Andalus, she creates a female character who is not only sexually assertive, but who actually punishes the male protagonist for not being good enough in bed. Imagine writing performance reviews for your medieval lovers, and you're getting close to Marie's level of savage honesty. But perhaps the most shocking rebel of all was a woman whose real name we'll never know, but who wrote under the pseudonym the Anonymous Lady of the Court. And we know it was a woman because of certain linguistic markers in her writing. Produced what can only be described as medieval erotica, so explicit that most of it was burned by horrified church officials. What survived, hidden away in a private manuscript collection in Bavaria, includes detailed descriptions of female anatomy written from a woman's perspective, instructions on how to achieve what we now call an orgasm. This is a part that made me nearly fall off my chair when I first read it. A comprehensive critique of male sexual techniques with specific suggestions for improvement. Think about that for a moment. Nearly 1,000 years ago, when women were supposedly silent and subservient, some brilliant rebel was essentially writing the joy of sex with commentary that would make modern sex therapists nod in approval. She wrote about foreplay, about the importance of emotional connection, about communication between partners, concepts we think of as modern discoveries. But here's what makes these women truly extraordinary. They weren't just writing for shock value or for personal expression. They were engaged in an act of profound political rebellion. By claiming ownership of their sexuality, by writing about desire from a female perspective, they were challenging the very foundations of medieval power structures. In the 11th century, a woman's body was considered property. Her sexuality belonged first to her father and was primarily valuable for its ability to produce legitimate heirs. By writing about their own desires, their own pleasure, their own sexual agency, these women were committing what amounted to intellectual theft. They were stealing back ownership of their own bodies, one poem at a time, and the risks were enormous. We have records of women being excommunicated, exiled, and even executed for much less provocative writing. The fact that these poems survived at all is nothing short of a miracle. Many were preserved only because sympathetic scribes hid them within collections of religious texts, or because they were copied and passed secretly from woman to woman, like some kind of medieval underground literary network. Take Castellosa, another Provençal poet whose work survived by sheer luck. She wrote with such raw honesty about unrequited love and sexual frustration that her poems read like personal diary entries. In one particularly visceral piece, she describes a physical ache of desire so vividly that you can feel her frustration radiating off the page. She writes about lying awake at night, her body burning with want, unable to think about anything but the object of her desire. But what's remarkable isn't just that she wrote about these feelings, it's how she wrote about them. With no shame, no apology, no suggestion that her desires were wrong or sinful. She claimed her sexuality as completely and naturally as she might claim ownership of her horse or her jewels. And then there's a mysterious Domna H., whose identity scholars have been trying to crack for decades. We know she was educated, probably noble, and definitely fearless, because her poetry includes what can only be described as early feminist theory disguised as love songs. She writes about the hypocrisy of men who demand sexual purity from women while pursuing their own pleasures freely. She critiques the double standards of courtly love, where men were praised for having multiple lovers while women were shamed for having any desires at all. In one particularly biting piece, she creates a fictional dialogue between a woman and her would-be seducer, where the woman systematically dismantles every argument he makes for why she should sleep with him. It's sharp, it's funny, and it's absolutely devastating in its logic. You realize you're witnessing the birth of sexual consent theory, written by a woman who somehow understood concepts that wouldn't be widely accepted for another 800 years. These women were not just rebels, they were incredibly sophisticated artists. They developed new poetic forms, experimented with language in ways that influenced literature for centuries, and created works that were simultaneously deeply personal and universally resonant. They played with rhythm and rhyme in ways that made their erotic content even more seductive. Their poems weren't just sexually explicit, they were sexually hypnotic. And here's something that'll blow your mind. These women were networking. We have evidence of poems written in response to each other, of literary friendships, and rivalries that spanned hundreds of miles. A community of female voices that supported and challenged each other, sharing techniques not just for writing, but for surviving as sexual beings in a world that wanted to erase them entirely. The question that keeps historians awake at night is simple. If these women existed, if they were writing so boldly and beautifully, why don't we know more about them? How did such extraordinary voices get erased from the story we tell about the Middle Ages? That's where our story takes a darker turn. Because what happened next wasn't accidental. It was a systematic, deliberate, and devastatingly effective campaign of suppression. The golden age that allowed these women to flourish was about to end, and the forces that would silence them were already gathering strength. The golden age of female expression. What if I told you that the 11th century wasn't the backward, oppressive period you've been taught to imagine? What if the truth is so radically different from everything you learned in school that it would completely flip your understanding of medieval history on its head? The shocking reality is that the 11th century was actually a golden age for female expression, and understanding why requires us to completely reimagine what medieval Europe looked like. Forget the stereotypes of dark, brutal times filled with ignorant peasants and oppressive lords. The 11th century was experiencing what historians now call the medieval Renaissance, a period of unprecedented cultural flowering that happened centuries before the Italian Renaissance we all learned about. Picture Europe in the year 1050, buzzing with intellectual energy. Trade routes were reopening after centuries of isolation, bringing not just goods but ideas from across the known world. Arabic texts on philosophy, science, and yes, even sexuality were being translated in monasteries across Spain and southern France. Byzantine scholars were fleeing westward, carrying with them Greek classical texts that had been lost to Western Europe for generations. It was like the internet suddenly being invented. Information was flowing faster and more freely than it had in centuries. But here's what made this period uniquely special for women. Political power was still relatively decentralized. The crushing weight of later medieval hierarchy hadn't yet settled into place. In many regions, particularly in southern France, northern Italy, and parts of what's now Germany, women could inherit property, run businesses, and yes, even rule territories in their own right. Let me give you a concrete example that will blow your mind. In the year 1066, the same year as the Norman conquest of England, a woman named Matilda of Tuscany was ruling over one of the largest and most powerful territories in Italy. She commanded armies, negotiated with popes and emperors, and controlled trade routes that made her richer than most kings. And she was an anomaly. Women were wielding real political power in ways that would become unthinkable just a century later. This political power created something unprecedented, a class of educated women with leisure time, resources, and, most importantly, a degree of protection from immediate male control. These weren't women struggling for daily survival. These were women with access to libraries, education, and courts full of scholars and artists. And when you give educated, powerful women the time and resources to express themselves, magical things happen. Surprisingly, the church played a huge role in creating these conditions. I know what you're thinking. Wasn't the medieval church the enemy of female sexuality? The 11th century church was far more complex and contradictory than we usually imagine. While official doctrines certainly restricted women's roles, the practical reality was much more nuanced. Monasteries and convents were essentially the universities of the medieval world. Nuns weren't just praying all day. They were copying manuscripts, studying Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, engaging with classical literature, writing their own works. The Benedictine tradition, which dominated monastic life in the 11th century, actually encouraged intellectual pursuits as a form of worship. Many of the most educated women in Europe were nuns, and many of our boldest female poets were writing from within the protective walls of a convent. But here's where it gets really interesting. The church hadn't yet developed the paranoid, sex-obsessed theology that would characterize later medieval Christianity. The infamous Malleus Maleficarum, the witch-hunting guide that would terrorize women for centuries, wouldn't be written for another 400 years. The Inquisition was still just a glimmer in some future pope's eye. In the 11th century, the church was more concerned with political power struggles than with policing individual sexuality. This created what historians call theological breathing room. As long as you didn't directly challenge the church's authority, you could explore a wide range of ideas, even sexual ones, with relative safety. Many of our female poets cleverly used religious language and imagery to discuss sexuality, creating works that could be read as either spiritual or erotic depending on the reader's perspective. It was a brilliant strategy of hiding in plain sight. The economic conditions were equally important. The 11th century saw the rise of what historians call the commercial revolution. Towns were growing, trade was expanding, and for the first time in centuries, there was significant wealth outside of pure land ownership. This meant that women could sometimes accumulate independent wealth through trade, inheritance, or royal favor. And wealth, as we all know, buys a certain degree of freedom. Consider the case of southern France, particularly the region of Provence. This area was experiencing an unprecedented economic boom thanks to its trade links with the Islamic world and the Byzantine Empire. The courts of the local nobles were cosmopolitan, international spaces where ideas flowed as freely as wine. With its sophisticated and often sensual treatment of love, was being translated and adapted. Byzantine court culture, with its complex traditions of female patronage, was influencing local customs. It was in this vibrant environment that the tradition of courtly love emerged, but not the sanitized, chaste version we usually hear about. The original courtly love tradition was far more sexually explicit and female-centered than later adaptations would suggest. In this world, women weren't passive objects of desire. They were active participants, judges, and often the driving force behind these elaborate games of seduction and power. The linguistic situation was also crucial. While Latin was still the language of official church business and legal documents, vernacular languages like Old French, Occitan, and Middle German were beginning to flourish as literary languages. This meant that women could write in their native tongues, making their work accessible to other women who might not have had a formal Latin education. They were creating a popular literature by and for women in a way that hadn't existed since classical antiquity. But perhaps most importantly, the 11th century had not yet developed the later medieval obsession with female purity. While women were certainly expected to be chaste, the crushing weight of impossible moral standards hadn't yet settled into place. There was still room for women to be human, to make mistakes, to have desires, to be complex, contradictory beings rather than flattened symbols of virtue or vice. All of these factors, political decentralization, economic prosperity, religious flexibility, linguistic innovation, and cultural openness, combined to create what we might call a perfect storm for female literary expression. Shining moment in European history. Conditions aligned to allow women to write about sexuality with a freedom and boldness that wouldn't be seen again for centuries. And here's where our story takes a darker turn. These conditions were fragile. They depended on a delicate balance of political, economic, and social factors that was already beginning to shift by the end of the 11th century. The forces that would eventually silence these remarkable women were already gathering strength, waiting in the wings to transform Europe into something much more rigid, much more hierarchical, and much more hostile to female expression. The stage was being set for one of the most systematic campaigns of intellectual suppression in human history, the art of subversion. Imagine being so clever that you could write the most scandalous love poetry in history while sitting in the same room as bishops and abbots, and they would actually applaud you for your spiritual devotion. That's exactly what these medieval women mastered. The art of hiding explosive sexual content in plain sight, using techniques so sophisticated that modern cryptographers would be impressed. These weren't just poets. They were linguistic ninjas, masters of secret code that allowed them to say absolutely anything while maintaining complete deniability. And the methods they developed are so brilliant that once you understand them, you'll never read medieval literature the same way again. Let's start with their most devious technique, the religious metaphor. In the 11th century, the most socially acceptable way to talk about intense passion, mystical religious experience. The church actually encouraged vivid descriptions of spiritual ecstasy. The more intense, the better. Simply borrow the vocabulary. Take this example from an anonymous 11th century nun whose work was preserved in a German monastery. My soul burns with such a fire that I cry out in the night, and my body trembles as a divine presence fills me completely, bringing such a sweet release that I am undone. She's describing a religious vision, but read it again slowly. Tell me that's not one of the most erotic descriptions of physical pleasure you've ever encountered. The genius is that it operates on both levels simultaneously. A conservative reader could nod approvingly at her piety, while a more worldly reader would understand exactly what she was really describing. It's like having a secret conversation in a crowded room where only half the people speak your language. This game of religious metaphor went even deeper. These women became masters at using biblical imagery that would make a theology professor blush, being pierced by love's sweet arrows, and lying in the Garden of Delights. This was all sanctioned biblical language, but it was layered with sexual innuendo so thick you could cut it with a knife. One of my favorite examples comes from Hildegard of Bingen, the famous mystic nun who is now a saint. She describes an embrace that flowed with such sweetness that all who tasted it were overcome with such pleasure that they could not speak. The official interpretation is that she's describing divine love. Read that description and tell me she's not writing about the best night of her life. Then there was the art of botanical metaphor. Medieval people were obsessed with gardens, and poetry about flowers was completely socially accepted. So, naturally, our rebel women turned flower descriptions into detailed anatomical guides. They'd write about tender rose buds waiting to bloom, secret gardens hidden behind protective walls, and about the sweet nectar that flows when a flower is properly tended. The anonymous lady of the rose garden, that's obviously a pseudonym, wrote an entire sequence of poems that read like innocent nature poetry until you realize she's basically created a medieval version of the joy of sex using nothing but flower metaphors. It's absolutely brilliant and absolutely filthy once you crack the code. Perhaps the most sophisticated technique was what scholars now call the complaint tradition. It was perfectly acceptable for women to write poetry lamenting their fate, expressing sadness about their lot in life. These clever poets developed an entire subgenre of complaints that sounded like pious resignation, but were actually scathing critiques of sexual hypocrisy. They'd write things like, "Alas, that nature has made me with such a hunger that cannot be satisfied by spiritual bread alone." They were lamenting their weak female nature. They were calling out the impossible standards imposed on women, while men were free to pursue their own desires. The scholarly debate format was another favorite tool. Medieval intellectuals loved formal disputations, structured arguments about philosophical or theological questions. These brilliant women created fake academic debates between allegorical figures like Lady Reason and Dame Passion, or Sister Prudence and Lady Desire. These debates would tackle questions like whether it is more virtuous for a woman to deny her natural inclinations or to embrace them in moderation. The format gave them cover to explore incredibly radical ideas while maintaining the appearance of serious intellectual inquiry. One anonymous author created a debate between Lady Chastity and Lady Love that reads like a legal brief arguing for women's sexual rights, with Lady Love presenting evidence from nature, philosophy, and even theology to argue that denying physical desire is actually contrary to divine will. The musical element was also crucial. Many of these poems were meant to be sung, and the melody could completely change the meaning of the words. A song that sounded like a pious hymn when sung slowly and solemnly could become something entirely different when performed with a more lively rhythm and expression. It was like having a secret soundtrack that transformed innocent words into intimate communication. But perhaps the most audacious technique was what I call the authority borrowing game. These women would take respected male authors, church fathers, classical poets, biblical figures, and put words in their mouths that those men would have been horrified to speak. As St. Augustine reminds us, the body has needs that cannot be denied. Following the wisdom of Ovid, we must remember that love requires both tenderness and passion. The beauty of this technique was that it was almost impossible to challenge. Who was going to argue that St. Augustine didn't say something when the alternative was admitting they weren't familiar enough with his complete works to be certain? It was intellectual jujitsu, using the weight of male authority against the very system that created it. These coding techniques weren't just clever literary tricks. They were survival strategies. The women who developed them were playing for the highest possible stakes. Their reputations, their freedom, and sometimes their very life. The fact that they managed to preserve and transmit such bold ideas while maintaining plausible deniability represents one of the most sophisticated acts of cultural resistance in human history. And they weren't just protecting themselves. They were creating a legacy, knowing that future generations of women would need these tools and would use them to continue the conversation about female desire and agency. A revolution in disguise. Welcome to most exclusive literary salon in medieval history, a place so sophisticated, so revolutionary, that it would reshape the very concept of romantic love for centuries to come. But here's the twist that'll keep you on the edge of your seat. This wasn't happening in some hidden underground meeting. This was taking place in the most glamorous, powerful courts of medieval Europe, under protection of women, who were essentially the medieval equivalent of media moguls. The story begins behind the elegant walls of the most influential court in 12th century Europe, where the rules of love, sex, and literature were being completely rewritten by women who had the power, the vision, and the sheer audacity to challenge 1,000 years of tradition. At the center of it all was a revolution disguised as entertainment. Picture the court of Eleanor of Aquitaine around the year 1170. We're talking about a woman who controlled more territory than the King of France, who had been Queen of France and would become Queen of England, and who decided that the boring, male-dominated literature of her time simply wasn't good enough. She did what any brilliant CEO would do. She disrupted the entire industry. But Eleanor wasn't working alone. Her daughter, Marie de Champagne, was running what was essentially a medieval think tank dedicated to revolutionizing how society talked about love and sexuality. They created what historians now call the courtly love revolution. But what most accounts don't tell you is how radical, how sexually progressive, and how female-dominated this movement really was. Marie's court in Troyes wasn't just a place where pretty poems were recited. It was a laboratory where the very foundations of romantic relationships were being examined, questioned, and completely rebuilt from the ground up. And the women running this laboratory had some revolutionary ideas. They created what they called the courts of love. Before you roll your eyes thinking about some romantic fantasy, let me tell you what these really were. These were formal proceedings, like a court of law, where real relationship disputes were heard and decided by panels of noble women. The cases they were hearing and the judgments they were making were so sexually progressive that they would be controversial even today. We have actual records of these proceedings, preserved in the writings of Andreas Capellanus. Case study number 1. A knight claims that because he has performed military service for a lady, she owes him sexual favors. Sexual consent cannot be earned through other services and must be freely given without coercion. This is 1174. They were developing consent theory 800 years before the #MeToo movement. A married woman wants to know if she can take a lover, since her husband is having affairs. Marriage without mutual affection is essentially invalid, and if a husband breaks the bonds of fidelity, the wife is free to seek emotional and physical satisfaction elsewhere. Medieval divorce court. But the most shocking case of all involved a question that still makes relationship experts debate today. Can true love exist between married couples? And the court's answer was a resounding no. They argued marriage in their time was about property and politics, while true love required freedom of choice. They were essentially arguing that the entire medieval marriage system was incompatible with authentic romantic relationships. Marie de Champagne didn't just encourage these debates, she systematized them. She commissioned what was essentially the first relationship manual in European history, called The Art of Courtly Love. But here's what your literature professor probably didn't tell you. This wasn't some idealized, chaste romance guide. It was a comprehensive exploration of sexual psychology that wouldn't look out of place in a modern relationship. The manual includes detailed discussions of how to seduce someone, how to maintain passion in a long-term relationship, how to navigate the complex emotional and physical aspects of desire, and yes, how to ensure that both partners find satisfaction in their physical encounters. It's basically the art of seduction, written by medieval women who understood psychology better than most modern dating coaches. But Marie's real genius was in how she marketed this revolution. She didn't present it as a challenge to traditional authority. She presented it as entertainment. She commissioned troubadours to write songs that incorporated these new ideas about love and sexuality. She patronized poets who could take these radical concepts and wrap them in beautiful, memorable verses that would spread across Europe like medieval viral content. And the marketing worked. Within a generation, every sophisticated court in Europe was adopting the courtly love model. But here's the part that'll blow your mind. Most of the courts that adopted it had no idea how radical the original version was. Marie and her collaborators had essentially created a Trojan horse, packaging revolutionary ideas about female sexual agency inside entertainment that looked harmless on the surface. The sophistication of this operation was incredible. Marie carefully selected writers who could handle complex psychological and social themes. She created what was essentially a writer's room, where poets, philosophers, and legal scholars worked together to develop narratives that could change how people thought about relationships. One of her star collaborators was Crétine de Troyes, whose Arthurian romances are still read today. But what most people don't realize is that these weren't just adventure stories. They were carefully crafted explorations of the new relationship model that Marie's court was developing. Every romantic encounter, every interaction between knights and ladies was designed to model the new principles of mutual respect, female agency, and sexual equality. Marie's most brilliant innovation was what she called the rules of love. These weren't just poetic guidelines. They were a comprehensive philosophy that completely inverted traditional power structures. According to Marie's rules, the woman was always the dominant partner in a romantic relationship. She set the terms, she decided the pace, and she had absolute veto power over any man's advances. Male courtiers who wanted to pursue relationships had to follow elaborate protocols designed to ensure female consent and comfort, demonstrating their worthiness not through dominance but through sensitivity, intelligence, and respect. Marie's court became known throughout Europe as a place where women felt safe to express themselves, where female intelligence was celebrated, and where relationships were based on mutual respect. It was basically a medieval feminist utopia. But she didn't stop there. She began what can only be described as a medieval franchise operation, spreading her model to courts across Europe through a network of female allies. She arranged strategic marriages, established correspondence networks, and even created an exchange program for young noble women. Within 2 generations, Marie's influence could be felt from Scotland to Sicily. She had created the first international women's movement, disguised as a cultural phenomenon. Of course, this level of influence didn't go unnoticed. The church, secular rulers, and traditionalist nobles were beginning to realize that something fundamental was shifting in European culture, and they weren't happy about it. The stage was being set for a backlash that would be swift, brutal, and devastatingly effective. The backlash and the Great Erasure. The darkest chapter of our story begins not with dramatic persecution or public burnings, but with something far more insidious, a systematic campaign of intellectual erasure so methodical, so complete, that it would successfully convince future generations that these revolutionary women had never existed at all. What happened next wasn't just censorship, it was historical genocide, the deliberate murder of an entire literary tradition that had dared to challenge the foundations of medieval power. The blueprint they created for silencing women's voices was so effective that we are still living with its consequences today. The backlash didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, creeping horror that began in the early 13th century and accelerated with each passing decade. But we can trace the beginning of the end to a specific moment, the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215. Pope Innocent III made decisions that would fundamentally reshape European Christianity in ways that were catastrophic for women's intellectual freedom. Buried in the official decrees was language that would be used to justify centuries of persecution. The council formally codified the doctrine that women were inherently more susceptible to spiritual corruption, that their emotional and sexual nature made them dangerous conduits for her. But they didn't just declare women spiritually unreliable. They created a bureaucratic system designed to systematically identify and eliminate any form of female religious or literary expression that didn't conform to increasingly narrow standards of acceptable femininity. The mystical nuns who had been celebrated were being investigated for heresy. The courts of love were condemned as sources of moral corruption. The Trobarits, who had been welcomed in the most sophisticated courts, were finding their performances banned. The speed of this transformation was breathtaking. Consider the case of the Beguines, communities of religious women who had operated independently and produced some of the most sophisticated mystical literature. In 1200, they were respected. By 1310, the most famous Beguine writer, Marguerite Porete, was being burned alive in Paris for heresy. The Mirror of Simple Souls, that explored the same themes of divine love and spiritual union that had been celebrated just a century earlier. The only difference was that the political climate had changed, but the destruction of Marguerite Porete wasn't just about eliminating one troublesome woman. It was a calculated public spectacle designed to send a message to every other woman who might be tempted to write about spiritual or sexual themes. The church ensured every detail of her trial and execution was widely publicized, creating a climate of terror that would discourage others from following her example. Within decades, the networks of female writers that had flourished across Europe were dissolving. But the most devastating aspect of this oppression wasn't what happened to women themselves. It was what happened to their works. This was about erasing the evidence that bold female voices had ever existed in the first place. The systematic destruction began in earnest around 1250. We have records of church officials ordering the confiscation and burning of manuscripts deemed inappropriate. We have evidence of monastery libraries being purged. But perhaps most insidiously, we have documentation of a deliberate campaign to reattribute female-authored works to male writers. Poems that had been clearly identified as written by women were suddenly being credited to anonymous male troubadours. Mystical texts by brilliant nuns were republished under male pseudonyms. The process was so thorough that by 1300, most people genuinely believed that women had never been significant contributors to medieval literature. The very idea that women might have written sophisticated poetry about love and sexuality had become literally unthinkable. Scribes were literally changing pronouns and grammatical markers to make female-authored texts appear to be written by men. The institutional structures that had supported these women were also co-opted and transformed. The courts of love were gradually changed from forums for female agency to entertainment venues where women were passive objects of male desire. The mystical traditions were redesigned to emphasize female submission and self-denial. The very concept of courtly love was systematically reinterpreted to remove all traces of female agency, transforming it into a tradition that idealized unrequited male desire for unattainable women. The masterpiece of this campaign was the creation of new models of ideal femininity, deliberately designed to be incompatible with the bold self-expression of the earlier period. The cult of the Virgin Mary was systematically developed to create an impossible standard of female purity that made any expression of sexual desire automatically sinful. The new ideal woman was silent, passive, and completely asexual. Any woman who deviated from this model was seen as morally corrupt. The psychological warfare was incredibly sophisticated. Instead of just banning female expression, the authorities created new models of female holiness that made previous forms of women's writing seem shameful and degraded. They convinced women that true spiritual advancement required the rejection of physical desire and intellectual ambition. By 1350, the transformation was essentially complete. The golden age of female literary expression had been so thoroughly suppressed and rewritten that most people genuinely believed it had never existed. But here's what the suppressors didn't count on. Some of these women saw what was coming, and they took steps to preserve their legacy for future generations who might be brave enough to rediscover it. The story of how they managed to hide their most dangerous ideas in plain sight, ensuring their voices would survive even the most systematic campaigns of censorship, is one of the most inspiring examples of intellectual resistance in human history. The resurrection and the unbroken chain. Deep within the pages of seemingly innocent prayer books and religious manuscripts, a secret conspiracy was unfolding that would preserve some of the most revolutionary ideas in human history. These medieval women didn't just disappear quietly into the shadows. They fought back with sophistication that makes modern resistance movements look amateur, creating hidden networks and secret codes that would keep their dangerous ideas alive for centuries. And the most incredible part? Their hiding places were so clever that we are still discovering that when these brilliant women realized their world was changing, they didn't despair. They created what amounts to the most sophisticated information preservation system. The first line of defense was what scholars now call manuscript camouflage. They would take a controversial poem about female sexuality and embed it in the middle of a lengthy meditation on the lives of saints, using formatting and language that made it blend seamlessly. Church censors would see page after page of acceptable religious content and assume the entire collection was safe. But hidden within the orthodoxy were verses that would have gotten their authors burned if discovered. The camouflage went deeper. They developed steganography, the art of hiding information in plain sight. They created elaborate acrostics, where the first letters of lines spelled out hidden messages. They used numerical codes based on biblical verses to encode their most sensitive ideas. One of the most sophisticated examples was discovered in 1987 in a manuscript from a German convent. The text appears to be a conventional prayer cycle, but scholars realize that certain phrases, when read according to a complex mathematical pattern, spelled out what amounts to a medieval treatise on female sexual autonomy. But individual acts of preservation weren't enough. They created what historians are now calling the Medieval Underground Railroad, a network for preserving and transmitting forbidden knowledge that spanned all of Europe. Women would copy the most important texts and distribute them through carefully established channels, operating through existing religious and family connections, but with layers of secrecy. And they didn't just preserve the original texts. Each generation in the network would add their own insights, developing the ideas further. They were running an underground university, with knowledge accumulating and evolving even as the official culture grew more restrictive. They also developed elaborate oral traditions. They created songs, stories, and even children's games that encoded revolutionary ideas. One remarkable example involves a collection of what appear to be innocent lullabies. But when you analyze the lyrics carefully, you realize they are teaching songs designed to pass down concepts about consent, female desire, and women's rights from mothers to daughters. Your body is your own. No one else may call a home. Taught young girls fundamental concepts about bodily autonomy. The rediscovery began in the 14th century, in the most unexpected place. A nun named Agnes Mueller, while cataloging manuscripts, noticed that a recipe for honey cakes to bring joy to troubled hearts contained strange numerical patterns and unusual ingredient combinations. She realized she was looking at a code. When she finally cracked it, she found a complete poem about female sexual pleasure disguised as baking instructions. The honey represented desire, the kneading described specific physical techniques, and the rising time was a metaphor for arousal. It was a medieval sex guide, written by a woman for women, hidden in plain sight. This discovery was just the beginning. A secret network of female scholars, calling themselves the Daughters of Memory, formed, dedicated to reconstructing the lost works of their predecessors. Working in absolute secrecy, they developed techniques for identifying coded texts, decrypting messages, and piecing together complete works from scattered fragments. They were running a medieval intelligence operation, recovering lost poetry about love and desire. By 1400, they understood the true scope of what had been lost. But they also knew the world was still too dangerous to reveal their discoveries publicly. So they made a brilliant and heartbreaking decision. They would continue the preservation in secret, but also begin the slow process of reintroducing these ideas into European culture, became literary guerrillas, gradually seeding the recovered concepts back into the mainstream. They wrote new works incorporating themes from the recovered texts. They influenced which manuscripts were copied in monasteries. The influence of their work began showing up in unexpected places. The late medieval Romance tradition suddenly became more sophisticated in its treatment of female psychology. Religious texts began incorporating more nuanced discussions of spiritual experience. In essence, the Renaissance didn't spring fully formed from a sudden burst of creativity. It was partly built on ideas developed by medieval women centuries earlier, preserved through the dark period of suppression, and carefully reintroduced when conditions were more favorable. When Christine de Pizan wrote the Book of the City of Ladies in 1405, becoming Europe's first professional female writer, she wasn't creating something entirely new. She had access to some of these preserved manuscripts, and was continuing a conversation that had been interrupted but never fully ended. The thread continues through the Enlightenment, when philosophers like Mary Wollstonecraft argue for women's intellectual equality, drawing on a tradition that stretched back centuries. The survival of these texts provided crucial evidence for later feminist movements, proving that women's supposed intellectual inferiority was a cultural myth. The coding techniques developed by medieval women even provided models for later resistance movements like the suffragettes. The most profound legacy of these medieval women is not just the specific ideas they preserved, but the model of resistance they created. They show that even in the most oppressive circumstances, authentic voices can find ways to survive and eventually triumph. Their courage literally made our freedom possible. A legacy of choice. Here we are, nearly 1,000 years later, and the question that haunts me is this: what would these medieval women think if they could see our world today? Would they be amazed by how far we've come, or horrified by how many of the same battles we're still fighting? Their story isn't just ancient history. It's a mirror reflecting our own struggles with stunning clarity. In 2025, we live in a world where women can publish whatever they want, where female sexuality is openly discussed, where consent is widely recognized as fundamental. By medieval standards, we are living in an unimaginable utopia of female freedom. The patterns these women fought against are still playing out. Women's intellectual contributions are still minimized. Female sexuality is still policed and shamed. The techniques for silencing women's voices have evolved, but the underlying impulses remain remarkably constant. The medieval church burned manuscripts. Internet trolls dox and threaten women who express similar ideas today. The technology has changed, but the goal is identical: to create such a hostile environment that women will self-censor. But here's what gives me hope. Every single freedom we enjoy today was paid for by women like the ones we discussed. Every time you express an unpopular opinion, every time you make your own choices about your relationships and sexuality, every time you refuse to be silenced, you are exercising rights that were preserved at enormous cost by women who knew they might never live to see their ideas accepted. The medieval women who hid erotic poetry in prayer books created the intellectual foundation for modern feminism. Their courage made our freedom possible, but their legacy also carries a responsibility. These ideas didn't survive by accident. They survived because people were willing to fight for them, to preserve them, to pass them on. And that raises a question. What are we preserving for future? What dangerous truths are we willing to protect? What voices are we amplifying that might otherwise be silenced? The medieval women whose stories we shared tonight, they were changing history. They were just trying to live authentically, to express their truth, to maintain their humanity. But their individual acts of courage accumulated into movements that transformed the world. We are in the same position today. Every authentic voice we protect, every dangerous idea we preserve, every time we refuse to let important conversations be silenced, we are contributing to changes that might not be fully realized for generations. Their story reminds us that progress is fragile, that freedoms can be lost as well as gained, and that every generation has to fight to preserve the advances made by their predecessors. But most of all, their legacy reminds us that we are not alone. We are part of an unbroken chain of people who have fought for authentic expression, sexual autonomy, and the right to be fully human. When we face moments of doubt or despair, we can remember that other people have faced worse and still found ways to preserve hope and create change. The voices of these medieval women called to us across 1,000 years, reminding us that courage is contagious, that ideas are indestructible, and that authentic expression will always find a way to survive and eventually triumph. Their poems about love, their treatises about consent, their explorations of sexuality, these were not just literature. They were acts of resistance, declarations of independence, and gifts to future generations who would need to know that such thoughts were possible. As you drift off to sleep, remember that you are carrying forward a conversation that began in medieval convents and courts. The freedom you have to think your own thoughts, to express your own desires, to make your own choices about your body and your life. These freedoms were imagined, fought for, and preserved by women whose names we'll likely never know, but whose courage changed everything. Their story is far from over. It continues every time someone speaks truth, challenges oppressive systems, or refuses to be silenced. It continues in your own life, in your own choices, in your own courage to be authentic in a world that often prefers conformity. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through one of history's most remarkable and hidden stories. Thank you for having the curiosity to learn about these extraordinary women and the patience to follow their complex and inspiring tale. Stay curious, stay brave, and keep listening for the whispers of history that might just change how you understand everything. Until next time, sleep well, knowing that you are part of a tradition of courage that stretches back 1,000 years and that will continue long into the future, carried forward by people like you who believe that every authentic voice deserves to be heard. Sweet dreams. And remember, you are the continuation of their story.